this video I'm going to give you some brief advice about how to take notes more effectively. Now, ineffective note taking is really going to undermine your efforts to learn, so it's very important that the practices you use when you're note taking are informed by psychological research. And we've known for a few decades now which note taking practices tend to work the best, but these aren't always the ones that students use. So in this video I'm going to tell you a couple of things you definitely shouldn't be doing when you take notes, and give you a very quick and easy method of taking notes that will transform the effectiveness of your note-taking process. One thing you definitely shouldn't be doing when you're taking notes is copying out information verbatim from your sources. What I mean by verbatim is copying things out word for word. Now, there are some people that seem to think that the effort required to transcribe information from one source into their notes is going to improve their memory performance, but it really won't. As we've discussed before, memory is not reproductive, it's reconstructive. So if all you're doing is copying information word for word from a source, that's really not going to help you remember that information. But it will take you ages, and it will mean you have to expend a lot of effort to do it. Unfortunately, that increased effort won't translate to improved results, and you won't remember the information any better than had you just read it. Another reason why it's a really bad idea to copy information verbatim from your sources into your notes is that the contents of notes have a habit of ending up in written work like essays or other assessed formats of work. And of course, if you haven't been very careful to identify in your notes that the words you've taken down are not your own, and then you include those in an essay, and you don't acknowledge the original author of that source appropriately, you're going to end up on the wrong end of a plagiarism charge. So that's the second reason why you shouldn't be using verbatim copying as a note-taking strategy. Another thing you should avoid when you're taking notes is reliance on the highlighter pen. Now, I know this is a perennial favourite of a lot of students, and some people seem to use a highlighter as if it worked like a supermarket scanner, and as soon as you've highlighted the information it was beamed straight into your head, and if only it was that simple. But the research on use of highlighters tends to indicate they don't work very well. And the reason for this is actually quite intuitive and simple. Often when a topic is new to you, everything seems important, so you end up highlighting pretty much everything, which kind of defeats the point of highlighting when you think about it. Another problem with the process of highlighting is the research tends to indicate that those that rely on it the most heavily are using it the least effectively and getting the least out of it. When it comes to highlighting, less is most definitely more. And in any case, highlighting is no substitute for actually thinking about the material and doing things like asking yourself how you would explain that material to someone who'd yet to read the source. So having covered a couple of note-taking practices that really don't work, let's move on to a practice that works much more effectively. And the practice I'm referring to here is called 3R. It stands for read, recite, and review. Now, the key to the success of 3R is that it takes advantage of something called the testing effect. And the testing effect is a psychological finding which indicates that if you ask someone to read a source and then you give them two options, say they can either reread that source a number of times or test themselves with feedback on the contents of the source for an equivalent amount of time, it's the participants who actually test themselves that will get a lot more out of the process of studying and be able to remember much more of the material they've tried to study. Now, that sounds like something that might be quite awkward to incorporate into your studying. And what 3R does is make the process of incorporating the testing effect much more organic and easy to implement. So let's have a look in more detail about the different stages of 3R. The first stage of 3R is, not surprisingly, read. But there is an important point to make here, and that's that it's really important that you break down your reading into manageable chunks. Probably won't surprise you to learn that there's absolutely no point in reading an entire book chapter, for example, in one sitting, because you're really not going to remember much of it at all, and it's far too much information for you to deal with at any one point in time. So what you do is you break your book chapter down into maybe paragraphs, for example. Now, once you've read the paragraph, you move on to the next stage of the 3R process, which is recite. The recite stage of 3R, like the reading stage, is fairly self-explanatory, but there is one piece of advice I'd give you, and that's that when you're trying to recite the information that you've just read, try and do it in writing as opposed to verbally. And the reason for this is your attempts to articulate what you've just read in writing can then form the basis of your notes as you move forward into the next stage of the 3R process, which is review. In the review part of the 3R process, what you want to do is compare what you've written down to the part of the source that you were reading. But when you do compare it, only look to see if you've actually captured the main points of the reading you've done, and also that you've got your facts straight. What you definitely don't want to do is compare what you've written to the source with a view to being able to reproduce that source exactly, because that defeats the object of note-taking completely. All you really need to do is capture the main points of what you've been reading and also make sure you've got your facts straight. Now, your first attempt at taking notes is probably not going to be particularly comprehensive, and you may have missed a few important points, or you may have not quite got your facts straight. That's fine. You just put your notes to one side, you read that small chunk of information again, you put your notes back in front of you, and from memory, you try and fill in the blanks and correct the inaccuracies in the first draft of your notes. And you repeat this process until you can remember enough of the important points of the piece you were reading, and that you can actually recall those important points factually accurately. Once you've done this, you can move on to the next chunk of reading you'd set yourself, i.e. the next paragraph of the piece of text you're reading. So the next time you're taking notes, give the 3R approach a go. It might seem a little bit more involved than just copying things verbatim or getting out the good old trusty highlighter pen, but the point is the 3R approach will be much more effective than these two approaches, and certainly a lot less time consuming than trying to copy notes verbatim from your sources.